Well, hello there. Who are you?
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Killing must feel good to God, too. He does it all the time. And are we not created in his image?
We all go a little mad sometimes.
After all, murder is, or should be, an art.
I could kill you now pretty easily. Do some interesting things before anyone showed up.
What are these films you can't wait to look at?
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast and the 20th episode of our series dedicated to on-screen serial killers of horror film and TV history. I'm your podcast host, Anna, and this one is going to get upsetting. Justin Kurzel's feature-length debut, The Snowtown Murders, sometimes just called Snowtown, has been described as a brutal endurance test and a social realist horror story. Based on the real-life murders that shocked Australia in the 90s, Snowtown is an unflinchingly bleak portrait of the hold that a violent personality can have over a teenager, a family, and an entire community even. Joining me to discuss the complexities of this film is the author, academic, and all-round doyen of horror, Alexandra Heller-Nicholas, who shares her insights on the film and also her own personal connection to the story that it's based on. Thanks to her, this one is a very special episode, but please be warned, the subject matter can be upsetting to some. So if you'd prefer not to listen, that's absolutely fine. You can still show your love for the podcast and this series by leaving us a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or just let me know what you think of this episode on socials. I'm still around at Anna B. Demented. And with all of that said, please enjoy our take on the Snowtown Murders. Do you know what, Alex? This is the first time I've seen this film.
I'm really sorry. It's a really, really, really distressing experience. It's a really upsetting film.
Upsetting.
Mm-hmm.
It really was. And I don't know what I expected of it. But I'm glad you're here to talk me through it.
I get really emotional about this film, so this could get full on.
That's okay. I welcome full on. I love full on.
Beautiful. Let's do it. Let's do it.
So before we get into Snowtown, I wanted to ask you, I'm asking this question of everyone on the series. What do you think when you think of serial killers at the movies?
So I grew up loving true crime. Like, just loving it. Like, I've described it in the past as I was a teenage boy for true crime. Like, I was into heavy metal and true crime. And as I've gotten older, that has ethically sat increasingly in increasingly more uncomfortable ways.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've had to kind of reflect on that and think about it. And that emotional work of thinking about why do I love true crime and why do I love serial killers in film has been labor. Like, I've actually kind of had to do the work to be able to sit with it. And I'm really glad that I did. I think that it's important work, you know, that I had to do to sort of, not to justify or excuse this fascination, but to be able to sit with it and to sit with myself and to sort of be able to sleep at night and not think that I'm sort of this sort of ghoulish, you know, spectator kind of, you know, delighting in human misery and in real human misery. You know, so when I think of serial killers in film, you know, obviously I think of things like Jack the Ripper, but I also think of things like that have kind of intersected with my own life in often confounding ways. So Wolf Creek is a strange movie. I love Wolf Creek, but I was hitchhiking from where I lived in Australia up a freeway to get to Sydney in my high school years with my friend. We were so naughty. And we were hitchhiking when the guy that film was based on was doing his stuff. And I told my mother that literally on my mother's deathbed, thinking it would be this funny joke. And she was like, yeah, nah, you're out of the will. And it's like only when she was like, that's actually not funny. I was like, oh, that's actually not funny. Like, that's a really strange thing that I did. And I was a ding dong. I was a really dumb kid. And Snowtown we'll obviously talk about too, but that's a film that sort of has intersected with my own experience. So there's an abstraction about serial killing films, especially being in Australia or being in the UK watching American cinema that feels so foreign and so far away. It may as well be Narnia. But when that's transposed into something that's a bit more familiar to me, it does get more complicated and it does get ethically more confronting and more complex.
And you're absolutely right. And, one of the many images that we have the serial killer movies is obviously the highway, the American highway, the hitchhiking killers, and even the serial killer as a media superstar in a way. We've overstylized it so much, and it's intersected so heavily with a whole nother industry of true crime that sometimes, and in the case of Snowtown, the Justin Kurzel film, sometimes when it's fictionalized in a way that tries to approximate reality, it becomes more impactful than when true crime purports to be the real story.
I like to think of something that's really fundamental to serial killer films and to true crime in general is the concept of emotional fidelity. And it's a phrase that I thought about a lot when I saw the film Holy Spider a few years ago, which is based on a real-life serial killer in the Middle East. And emotional fidelity for me is being true to a story, even if you're not true to the facts. You're kind of true to the emotion of a story. And, Snowtown isn't a documentary. Holy Spider isn't a documentary, but these films for me really excel because they have a kind of profound emotional fidelity that speaks to a truth. And this is what cinema does at its best, right? It has an emotional fidelity. It speaks to a truth in a fictional story that can't be expressed in any other way. And I think that when we come to true crime, that concept of emotional fidelity is actually political. It has a kind of very kind of philosophical, a kind of political value to it. It becomes really crucial, this feeling of emotional fidelity. What is the truth to which you are speaking?
And we'll get to it maybe towards the end of our conversation as to what you think is the truth that Snowtown speaks to. But to begin talking about the film, what is your own relationship with the film and perhaps even the case of the Snowtown murders themselves?
So I have a very complex relationship to this film, and I love it. I will fight in the Snowtown wars with a knife in my teeth. I think this film is an absolute masterpiece. I cannot defend it more strongly, and I don't think it needs defending, but I cannot praise it more strongly. I intersect personally with this in a couple of ways. I guess the most immediate way is these murders happened in the 1990s, so between I think 92, 93, right through to 1999, when the famous bodies were found in the barrel in the small town in South Australia of Snowtown. During that period, so from about 1995, end of 1995 onwards, I was living in Melbourne, which is one of the two major capital cities in Australia, but my boyfriend at the time lived in Adelaide, so I was sort of commuting back and forth. So I spent quite a lot of time in Adelaide during this period, during a good year or two right in the middle of this. And I was very familiar with it. And I knew I was staying in a different part of town, but, we knew people who lived in that part of town. Over the years, I've got friends that have come from that part of Adelaide. And it's a real place to me. And it's a time, I remember what that city looks like during that period. So I do have that sort of sense of immediacy. But the other way that I really intersect with this film, that I really connect to this film, is almost hard to put into words. And I apologize here if I'm sort of oversharing, but there's not really any way to describe it without talking about my own story. So I have a posh name. I have a hyphenated surname, Heller-Nicholas. And so people assume that I'm posh, which is fine. That's worked for me in the past. But the fact of it is, in the 1970s, there was a typographical error on the deed to my father's house. And it was cheaper for him in the parochial wilderness of Australia. It was actually cheaper for him to change his name legally to fit the deed of the house than it was to get a new deed. So that's where the hyphen came from. The hyphen in my name is a typo, is the short version. So I come from a world that looks like the world in Snowtown. And that I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that casually. The world that I grew up in feels like that world there's these recurrent scenes at a dinner table where there are these sort of community meetings around a kitchen table. And I have very strong memories of that from my childhood. And, my parents were amazing. My community was amazing. The horrors that happen in this film were not the horrors that I experienced and not the horrors that my friends experienced. But it was the same world. It was the same world. And there's a scene very early in the film, I think even in the first few minutes, where there's kids just outside of shops and they're just kind of goofing around on shopping trolleys. And it's just the most authentic vision of life in that world. You're just this, and I think it's something that the film captures really quite majestically and very calmly and casually, is this boredom, this intense boredom that is so hard to describe. And partially that's poverty, but also I think there's something about the geography of Australia that is worth flagging here. Australia as an island basically fits into the continental US. It's about the same size, but we have 8 cities. It's pretty much, it's not empty because it's the outback, it's bush, it's animals and amazing things. But in terms of population, we have 8 cities. It's a big country with very, very few people. And I think we're aware of that. If you're in Sydney or Melbourne, you can kind of fool yourself, or you can trick yourself into thinking that you're part of the world. But if you're in one of these smaller cities, that the myth of being part of the world is actually harder to maintain. So you do have this sense of isolation, and you do have this sense of dislocation from the culture that you're a part of as a white Australian. This sort of very Northern Hemisphere kind of Euro-American culture.
What's really interesting about what you bring up, and alongside your own personal experience, which, as a fan of Alexandra Heller-Nicholas, it's always lovely to learn more about you. But one thing that really struck me is how much time the film spent in its first third almost of the film easing us into this community, easing us into this family and this way of life. We spend a lot of time with them before John Bunting, who's the serial killer, the kind of the de facto leader of the crime and the perpetrator of the crimes, before he arrives on the scene. How do you think the film portrays and grounds us in this community?
I think a really important part of this film is that Justin Kurzel himself isn't a tourist. He's from Adelaide. He grew up 20 minutes from Salisbury North, where these murders happened. He knows this part of town. He knows this part of Adelaide. It's kind of his people, and it's kind of his world. This is not a tourist. He didn't sort of zoosh in from Sydney and decide to make a film about Snowtown. This is somebody who grew up in the area, and something that's often cited in this film that is clearly very important is the fact that, except for the actor who plays John Bunting, Daniel Henshaw, who is superb and won lots of awards, the rest of the cast were untrained actors that he found. He would go to the sort of shopping centres in Davern Park and, around Salisbury North, this part of Adelaide. Lucas Pittaway, who plays Jamie, who I think is incredible in this film, the main character. And I think that he has a real kind of Heath Ledger energy. I think that it's a real shame, actually, that he hasn't kind of gone on to have a really major career. But he was just a kid that they found, at the local fish and chip shop. And most of the people in this film do come from this world. So there isn't this feeling of rich kids slumming it. There isn't this feeling of poverty tourism. I think that there's an authenticity to this film. Just the production design, the way that these houses look is breathtaking to me. And I do have to stop and remind myself this isn't a documentary. But they're the houses that I grew up in. They're the people that I knew growing up. And
it's interesting you bring up the I want to talk a little bit about the dynamic between the performances, because there's Daniel Henshaw, who plays John Bunting, and then there's everyone else. And I was wondering, and for me, I recognize him a bit from his subsequent roles, but I understand that this is very much his breakthrough performance. And I haven't seen the other actors before in anything. Do you think the fact that it's him as one of the few trained actors versus the younger characters are all portrayed by local kids, by unprofessional actors, completely new faces. Does that add to the performances themselves? Do you see kind of a difference in the way that they embody their characters?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's actually really fundamental to the energy of the narrative, because John Bunting turns up and these kids have had these awful things happen to them. And they're really lost. They're really, really lost. And Bunting is this really charismatic force. And he speaks of a kind of, and the way that Henshaw plays him is that there is a kind of confidence and a sort of sense of presence and calmness and the idea of authority. You know, he really presents himself to this community as the guy with the answers. And, you know, these are, especially in the case of the three kids, you know, they're really traumatized. You know, they're not just processing their own trauma, they're processing their mother kind of dealing with what's happened to them as well. So that sense of the kids themselves being lost, and Jamie being lost in particular, and Henshaw playing Bunting, who's not lost, who's very self-assured and who's very confident, it kind of helps, I think, understand why he had the hold over these people that he did. And I think a lot of that comes from this sort of really curious tension between professional acting and amateur acting. It's like, you know, Henshaw's the one who knows what he's doing. He's literally the only trained actor in the film. He knows exactly what he's doing. Whereas the others were sort of winging it. You know, they were sort of amateurs and a little lost, and not, they didn't have that kind of professional basis that Henshaw did. Yeah. And I think that there's a direct parallel between the characters and between the kind of experience in acting of the cast.
I love that. And it's, you know, I didn't really realize that of that dynamic, but I felt it as I was watching the film for the first time earlier, and only figured out what it was after I learned that the young kids, the teenagers, were unprofessional actors that were scouted kind of from the area. But one of the things I wonder a lot when I'm watching these films, especially when they're sort of based on or inspired by real life crimes, which always adds a layer of tension and a layer of ickiness for me, because then, you know, are we praising this great actor or actress for imitating a terrible human being, a murderer, really well? Are we glamorizing a murderer? Are we trying to make them more charismatic or more charming or smarter than they actually were? And, you know, I was listening to admittedly a true crime podcast about John Bunting, and it was, you know, the way that it was almost parodic, the way that they were talking about him, and then watching this film afterwards, I'm like, there's nothing funny about this creep.
Right. The humor's a really big thing. A really, really big part of the broader Snowtown. It's hard for me, I think, to kind of separate Snowtown as a kind of phenomena, you know, like a real world event, and the film. Because I think you're right. I think the film is a very direct, and I think it's a very conscious antidote to the way that Snowtown was kind of presented in Australia as a joke. And we have here something really crucial about, and you know, some academic writing on this film has talked about this. The whole point of the Snowtown Murders, in retrospect, coming from a kind of more coming from a criminology background, is that it really displayed the kind of cultural derision for imperfect victims. We really like victims of any crime to be perfect. We want them to be wholesome and innocent, and we want them to be middle class. And in terms of class, this film is hugely important. I think Australia is really fucked up about class. Australians are really, really messed up about class. My mother is of a generation, and she believed it until the day she died, that Australia is a classless society. She really believed that. And I have to say for myself personally that class has been the biggest point of difference in my life that has really impacted me, like more than gender. Class is something that it took me decades. I was in my 30s before I realized how big a point of difference class was to me, to people that I knew in the world. And this film deals with Australian class really, really well, because it refuses to make bogans. It refuses to make poor people a punchline. It takes their deaths seriously. And that is something that really didn't happen when this story played out in the Australian media. There's a really awful awful. This is sort of just a random example, but one of the books that this film is based on is by a woman called Debbie Marshall, called Killing for Pleasure, The Definitive Story of the Snowtown Serial Murders. That book came out in 2006, and when it came out, one of the main newspapers in Australia, The Age, big broadsheet here, they ran a review called, and I'm not kidding here, Debbie Does Snowtown.
Oh, Jesus.
Like, to me, that's really typical of the way that Snowtown was treated. It was a punchline. And it was because these were not ideal victims. These were poor people and queer people and people of colour. You know, these were not ideal. These were not middle-class, white, suburban people.
Was it treated at the time as though their deaths didn't matter because they were not, as you mentioned before, the quote-unquote perfect victims? They were not, and this is going to come out sounding very harsh, because it wasn't a waste that their lives had been ended.
There really was a kind of sweeping. I mean, the book that I mentioned, she, you know, it's a useful book. It's very well researched, but she literally talks about us and them. Literally through that book, it's like, well, we live like this, but they live like this. There's this intense othering, and you know, I have on my notes for this, I have a list of the document that I have in front of me. I have a list of the victims' names, and every time I do anything on this film, I always have to kind of check in on that list, because these are, you know, the horror of Snowtown, and there's so many horrors of this story and of the film, is that they're actually the people that have been forgotten. You know, it's all like the body in the barrels, and it's all a kind of joke. And in the 90s, you know, there was another case in 1997 in a town called Moe, which is actually where my parents come from, which is very similar. It's a kind of regional town in Victoria, very similar to the kind of world that we see in Snowtown. And I love it. It's where my family come from. It's my home. And in 1997, there was a child was murdered there. A 1-year-old baby was murdered called Jaden Leskey. And the country lost its mind. This was 2 years before the bodies were discovered in Snowtown. But it became like this national punchline, you know, this sort of joke about these sort of bogans and the dead baby. And you forget, even now people forget that a child died. It became a kind of running gag. So this sort of classist dismissal of life that was deemed unimportant is something that was really entrenched culturally in Australia at the time.
And you actually bring me to a question that I wanted to ask you specifically, because in the film there's a moment where in one of these sort of, I think, community meeting scenes when they're around the dinner table and John is having one of his kind of very bluster-filled moments where he's goading people into describing violent scenes. And at one point he says it's an Australian tradition. And he's talking about violence, I think. And I was wondering what you thought about what he might mean by that and what Kurzel kind of was alluding to by that.
I think it's an enormously important line, and I think you are absolutely right to pick it up, because the one thing I haven't spoken about thus far is, in a way, the elephant in the room. I'm speaking to you now from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, both Snowtown and Salisbury North, which is, of course, Salisbury North is where the bulk of the murders happened, you know, on the outskirts of suburban Adelaide. Snowtown's is the place where they found the bodies. I think there was maybe one murder in Snowtown, but the rest of them were actually killed in Salisbury North. This is the traditional the traditional land of the Kayurana people. Murray Bridge is another place where that has been linked to these crimes. This is the traditional land of the I knew I'd mess this up. The Ngarrindjeri people. There's no treaty with the First Nations people of Australia. This is stolen land. This is straight up stolen land. And this history of white Australia is marked by colonial violence. And that's alive and well today. So this film, to me, you can't talk about Snowtown and you can't talk about that line in particular and not acknowledge somewhere the history of white Australia being built on blood-stained land. That is the colonial history of Australia. And not to underestimate the horrors of what actually happened in the real, you know, in the John Bunting murders at all. But the fact that, you know, the Snowtown killings are kind of considered, you know, the worst sort of serial killing crime, you know, the worst serial killing crimes in Australia. But of course, that's white Australia. And that's serial killing specifically, which, of course, is a kind of Western concept. It's a country that was built on the massacre of First Nations people. And it's not even that. It's like if you are Indigenous, if you are a person of colour, if you are a refugee, if you are queer, often if you're a woman, especially if you're a transgender woman, you're highly likely to fall through the cracks. And if you're more than one of those things get real tough real fast. And this takes us back to that idea of ideal victims.
Mm-hmm.
And this that some people's deaths are just not equal to others. Mm. And that in itself is the unspoken, that's what that line is referring to. Mm. And that's a belief that Australia is built on as a colonial country, that some people's deaths do not matter as much as other people's deaths.
And and I think that also underpins the so-called charm of the John Bunting character in this film. And I call him a character. I know he was a real person, but for the purposes of talking about the movie, I think it is worthwhile separating the fictionalized text from the real life events. Whenever he's in one of his moods, whenever he's at his most confident, he's still a predator. He's taken advantage of that, I think, history of violence, of that acknowledged violence, and also perhaps that class anger, the anger of the people of the community that he sort of is infecting with his approach, the anger that they might be feeling towards other powers or towards being ignored, that he's now directing towards people who are, queer people, gay men, who are sort of, they might consider that they're above, that they can punch down on them because they've been punched down on so many times.
Absolutely. And I think there's a couple of things at play here. And I think for me, there's a question that whenever I watch Snowtown, I'm always reminded of it. And I think it's a question that we as a culture tend to try to avoid. And that question is how do victims become perpetrators? How do we sit with that? And how do we think that through? And, whether it's Snowtown or whether it's Michael Jackson, it's something that we kind of avoid. It's too hard. We put it in the too hard basket. And Snowtown tackles that straight on. Mm. And largely, I think in the case of Jamie, that question is answered through the charisma of the Bunting character in the film. Mm-hmm. And that he gives him an answer. But the other thing that I think is really interesting about this film in particular is something that kind of haunted the court case. That this film, when the film came out, they actually unsealed a whole bunch of records related to the court case. And I believe after the film, there was still, I'm not sure whether they are still, I'm not sure whether they're still sealed, but there was a lot of material that was still not public coming from the court case. But certainly in kind of popular discourse, and, when I would speak to my family about the Snowtown Murders, something that came up a lot, but doesn't really appear in the official documentation about Snowtown or about the Snowtown Murders is something called the family murders, which happened in the 70s and 80s in Adelaide, so the same city where these Snowtown murders took place. Mm-hmm. And the family murders were a series of horrendous sexual assaults and murders, horrendous, like graphically violent, unspeakable crimes that were committed against young men. I think there was 5 or 8 young men who were killed during this period by a group who were sort of nicknamed in the press as the family. And the family, only one man was ever charged with the murder. The other 4, they had suspects, but their names were never released, let alone, they were never tried. They never were, they were never arrested. So the bulk of the people that committed the family murders went free. And it's because in the kind of story has it is that they were powerful. These were surgeons and doctors and lawyers and judges who were doing these things. So that idea of exploitation and that the powerful people are here to destroy us is really embedded into Adelaide, especially at this particular time that the Snowtown murders took place. I don't think you can think about what happened with John Bunting and not acknowledge just in some way this sort of homophobia and this fear of violence really kind of stemmed from, and that's not to justify it, but there is this sort of bigger context that really haunted this particular city at this particular moment.
And how do you think, perhaps this is continuing the point you were making, but how do you think Kurzel threads authenticity and exploitation in this film? Because I don't think we can not talk about exploitation when we're talking about a movie being made based on this horrific case that was treated, as you were describing earlier, kind of as a joke at the time of it happening.
I really love true crime, and it's something that I've had to really think about. The older that I've got, it sat more uncomfortably with me. Mm-hmm. That maybe there's an aspect of my personality that is kind of ghoulish, that does kind of delight in the exploitation of these stories. And it's something that I've had to sort of tackle pretty head on. Mm-hmm. There's a wonderful book called Devil House by John Daniel, the guy from the Mountain Goats. And I reckon, like, if you're into true crime at all, this is such an essential book. It's a novel, but it really tackles the kind of the ethics of true crime in a way that I'd never really come across before.
Okay,
and it really it's brilliant, and it really helped clarify things for me, I think, about true crime. And I still love true crime. I always will. It's a part of my personality. But I think at its best, and what Snowtown does, and what Kurzel does, at its best for me, true crime works as a kind of memorial. It stands as a kind of testament, or allows us to pay witness or acknowledge in a really important cultural way that is the opposite of exploitation. And I think one of the most important things about Snowtown is that it refuses, and Kurzel got flack for this, and he really stood by his guns on this, but he refused to have a kind of status quo returning court case at the end. You know, he really rejected the idea that, you know, we would see justice fulfilled and that everything would return to normal. You know, there's a couple of quick screens of text that say, yep, these people were captured and they went to jail, but there's no satisfaction at the end of this movie. There's nothing that happens in the film that sort of takes away the horror of what we've just seen, because there is nothing that can, you know, justice doesn't work that way. Justice isn't restorative. It doesn't make things like they were before. And for me, that is very profound. And I do feel that the reason why I have so much admiration for this particular film is that it does feel like a memorial to me. It does give these people their story back. It does have an emotional fidelity, even if it is a fictional sort of version of a real life event. I think that there is a deep emotional fidelity to this film. And it is authenticity. It is giving people their names back, giving people their faces back, and sort of acknowledging that, you know, these might not be ideal victims, but what they went through was horrific. And I do think that there is something about that does stand as a monument.
So we're back to this idea of emotional fidelity that we started talking about. What do you think is the truth that Kurzel holds at the center of the film? I
think fundamentally we go back to what I was talking about with Australia's colonial history in a way, that the assumption in this country in very real ways every day on the news that some deaths are not equal to others. I feel that this film rejects that passionately. And any death is a horror story, and particularly the kind of nightmarish scenario that we have here with John Bunting and his the people that he was working with. These deaths mattered. These people mattered. They're not disposable. They might not be ideal victims, but their deaths are tragedies, and they are a loss, and there are people still mourning the deaths of these people, and that grief is very real, and it should be acknowledged.
And I want to talk about how he actually achieves that, because one of the ways that I think at least it came across to me was the way that he filmed violence. And he films violence very sparingly and very unglamorously. And one scene in particular really struck with me in the way that blood appears to be black. There's characters crying. It's so prolonged, it's torturous. You know, how do you feel that Kurzel kind of films the crimes and really underlines this idea that these deaths were tragedies and they should be spoken about and considered in that way, as opposed to, you know, quick or elegant murders that we then recount on podcasts and Wikipedia pages, Murderpedia pages, I should say.
Just as a technician, I think that Kurtzel is really remarkable. This was his first film. You know,
Yes.
he had a short film that played at Cannes in 2005. This was his first feature. And just obviously this is a film that I've watched a lot. I know that makes me sound psychotic, but the more that I watch it, the more I marvel at the craft of this film. And one of the things that he does is he made this film with a very regular, close collaborator called Sean Grant, who wrote the screenplay. There's a scene in the film where they're at the kitchen table, you know, this sort of community discussion, and Bunting is asking people what they would do if you caught one of these evil pedophiles, of course, which is sort of just to fuel his own homophobia to kill people, queer people in the community. And it sort of goes around the table, and people give these very graphic descriptions, and they're obviously trying to impress him, because the more extreme the descriptions get, the more enthused Bunting gets, and they want his approval. And the way that the verbalization of those fantasies works in the film is that it plants the seeds. You know, we hear these descriptions and we automatically have a mental image. So that later in the film or elsewhere in the film, when we actually see these really graphic murders taking place, we bring that kind of the impact of those descriptions to what we're actually seeing. So when you actually play out the nuts and bolts mechanics of what we're actually seeing on film, it's not as extreme as I often think it is, but it's been amplified by this planting of the seed of this much more extreme violence than we actually see on film. And it's masterful. It's really, really masterful.
I've read you write about the film, some of the pieces of writing that you've done about Snowtown, and you've talked about this film being radical. And I wonder, perhaps you've already spoken about it, but what do you think makes it radical? For the time, for the true crime space, or even the horror space?
I think it's radical because it took a national joke and made it serious. I think that alone makes this a really important film. Even now, Snowtown is like a joke. And I mean, the poor people of Snowtown, right? You know, I mean, the poor people who were murdered, obviously, but Snowtown is a town, you know, it's the distance between Adelaide and Snowtown is basically the distance between London and Swindon. So it's almost like these crimes took place in London and then they dumped the bodies in Swindon, and then they're now known as the Swindon Murders. No, you know, my apologies to the people of Swindon, but you get what I mean. Like, it's sort of the fact that we use Snowtown as a shorthand is in itself this sort of dark joke. You know, it's quite horrible. But I feel that this film is really important because it takes people seriously who culturally are not taken seriously in this country to this day. And that's as I said, you know, that's queer people, that's people who are living in poverty, you know, and that's tethered very, very tightly to a broader attitude in this country, again, that some people's deaths are worth more than others. That's what I keep coming back to, that line, that this film really aggressively, and I think quite radically, passionately rejects the ideas that some people's deaths are not as important as other people's deaths. I feel that this film is a testament that stands in retaliation of that really disgusting idea. I think it's really powerful, and I think it is really radical. And obviously, I think if you have a true crime film that is as graphic as this film is, the question of exploitation is obviously going to be there. And I wouldn't challenge anybody who felt this film was exploitative, because I bring my own emotional baggage to it, and I certainly wouldn't expect anybody else to have that baggage. But for me, I just feel that it validates the lives of the people that were killed. You know, it sort of says their deaths mattered. Their deaths really mattered, and they were horrible, and they're not funny.
And what was the film received like at the time, and how do you see it? How do you think it has aged since it was first released?
Look, I think it was. I think it's as powerful today as it was the day that it was made. You know, this is a film that's almost 15 years old. Obviously, it really established Kurtzel's career internationally with very, very good reason. It played. I believe it played in Critics' Week at Cannes that year. So you know, it certainly established him as like a major contemporary filmmaker. with good reason. It didn't make an awful lot of money. I think it actually lost money. I think it's roughly cited to have been made between 2 to 3 million, and I think it took about 1 million. So it didn't make a lot of cash. Critics really liked it internationally. In Australia, it was very loaded. There were the families of survivors, obviously, quite rightly, were quite distressed about the idea of the film, which is something that Kurtzel experienced more recently with his film Nitram, which is also based on a very notorious Australian true crime story.
Uh-huh.
And I wouldn't diminish the feelings of those people to feel that way. I think that, I would probably feel exactly the same way. Sean Grant, I think, the writer of this film, has a story that when the film had its world premiere at the Adelaide Film Festival, that there were people there who were who came from that world and who were sort of involved in that world, and family of people who died, and that they sort of said to him, yes, this is a good film. But obviously that's a fraught space. But yeah, financially, look, it wasn't a huge box office film. A friend of mine has a story that they saw in a cinema and the couple behind him were fucking. I love that story. I want to meet that couple because that's like, I hope they stayed together.
I hope they're still together.
Level. That is next level.
I hope that was a first date, because that's an amazing first date story.
I think about that a lot. It's the same friend that I have that she went on a blind date to Marina Devan's In My Skin.
Wow.
She's got great cinema stories.
Wow. But
if you're out there and you're listening and you had sex in the cinema at Snowtown, good for you. Psychopath.
Slide into my DMs. I want to know what happened. What happened next? Are you still together?
Did they have children?
Yes. Did you conceive during Snowtown?
That's a wild story for the 21st about where your parents. Yeah,
I thought I was back.
It's a whole new film, right? Like it's I
thought I was back because I took a date to a midnight screening of Knife Plus. Oh my god, what's that name? Knife Plus Party?
Knife Plus Heart?
Knife Plus Heart, yes.
Oh, I think that's really cute.
I mean, they fell asleep, so I enjoyed the film.
It's almost like a test. Like if they got into the film, that's a keeper. That's a keeper. And it's always like my friend going on a blind date to In My Skin. It's like if they stay together after that, that's like, it's the one.
Yeah, very true. Also just a gorgeous, gorgeous, disturbing film that is more disturbing because of the sound and the implication than anything that's actually shown on screen.
Exactly.
And, you mentioned already Kurtzel's kind of continuing his career afterwards, but it was his debut. And where is he now? This really established him on the international scene. Where is he now as a filmmaker?
So I think he's actually got a film coming out really soon, very soon, an American film, which is based on, again, it's another true crime film. I've gone blank on the name. I think it's called The Order. Yes, I'm right. I'm just going to bring it up on Wikipedia so I know what I'm talking about. At the time of us recording this, it doesn't have a release date, but I'm looking at big festivals thinking that it might be out at the end of the year. They're saying that it's going to be out before the end of 2024. He's done a film called The Order, which is based on a nonfiction true crime book called The Silent Brotherhood from 1989 by Zach Balin, which is about a kind of neo-Nazi white supremacist cult. So he's still doing stuff. This has got Jude Law, Nicholas Hoult, Journey Smollett. It's like a big American film. So yeah, he's going to be in the news pretty soon, I think, with that film.
He's really attracted to between Snowtown and Nitram and the upcoming The Order, which we haven't seen, and maybe even to a degree the Kelly Gang film. He's really attracted to true crime stories, so real life stories of criminals or crimes that sort of had an impact on communities.
Yeah, and the thing that I think really ties, Snowtown, True History of the Kelly Gang, and Nitram, for me, they're united not just because they're based on true crime stories, but they also are very mythic. These are very these are big nation-building, identity-building moments that these films are really built on. So they're not just true crime. They're kind of bigger than that. And obviously the True History of the Kelly Gang, or True History of the Kelly Gang, is really, really key when it comes to that. This sort of the national mythology of the bush ranger, this sort of, and the title of that, which obviously comes from the book that it was based on, the true history of the Kelly gang, the irony is that it's not a true history, And in a way, you could almost have true history of Nittrim and true history of Snowtown, in the way that he kind of tackles the way that these things have been kind of mythologized in the national imagination. Nittrim is a really, really great example of that. And that's a film that, when that film was announced, that was based on Martin Bryant, the killer of the notorious Port Arthur massacre. I've got the date for that here. The killer of the notorious Port Arthur massacre in April 1996. That film, in a way, Australians were really horrified as a whole that he was making that film, and they weren't able to shoot that film anywhere near where it actually happened because the locals were so outraged that they were even doing it. So it was shot in a completely different state.
Wow.
And it still sits a little uncomfortably with me. I think that I acknowledge that it's a really, really good film, but that film wasn't made for Australians. I feel that Nittrim was made, and I think it's very successful in that it's made as a kind of parable about gun control for American audiences. So Nittrim was very much made, I think, for non-Australian audiences. And I think that film sat largely pretty uncomfortably with Australians. Critics really liked it, but it wasn't the kind of film that, hey, let's go watch the Martin Bryant film. It's too raw. But it is a point of real honour, I think, for Australians that the reaction to the Port Arthur massacre was instant gun control. Instant. The next day, 2 days later, a very conservative prime minister, otherwise a pretty horrible man, but he acted immediately. He's like, we are done. We are not doing this. Guns, semi-automatics, guns, it's over. And acted immediately. And I feel that that's actually a real badge of honour for Australian. We had this sort of terrible gun massacre and we just called it straight away. But this is not a story for Australians. This is a story for Americans. And I do think that that's a kind of point of difference between Nittrim and perhaps something like Snowtown.
And Alex, before I let you go to enjoy the rest of your day and I tuck in for the night, is there anything about Snowtown that you wanted to mention that perhaps we haven't had a chance to discuss? I know you have some very strong opinions and feelings about this film.
I just want to say Adelaide's really beautiful. Adelaide, the kind of Adelaide that we see in this film is not Adelaide. Adelaide's called the City of Churches. It's this incredibly beautiful film, incredibly beautiful city. It's quite well known as being the only major capital city that was actually found by free settlers, it doesn't have convict origins. And they call it the City of Churches. It's very, very beautiful, and you can almost feel that history in the architecture. But it does have a dark history. So Adelaide has a kind of running gag as being the kind of weird, killy heart of Australia. And I think that there's a backlash between this very beautiful City of Churches, superficially beautiful place, with this kind of dark history. Channel 4 in the UK in 2002, they actually there's a whole thing where they had to withdraw a comment on TV. There was a documentary where they called Adelaide the murder capital of the world. It was this whole drama. And Salman Rushdie, there's a great Salman Rushdie quote. He said, Adelaide is Amityville or Salem and things here go bump in the night. So there is this idea that Adelaide is this kind of weird, violent space that kind of bubbles underneath the beautiful surface. My experience of Adelaide is that it's a beautiful place. It's a really beautiful place. I would move there in a heartbeat if I could. Adelaide, Snowtown shows a sort of slice of life that is perhaps ignored in the mainstream. But Adelaide as a whole, best food you'll ever have, aside from anything else. Beautiful place, and you should visit. Incredible.
Alex, thank you so much for your time and you're always an endless source of joy and wisdom. And can you please tell listeners where they can find more of your work online, where they can find your books?
Sure, I'm on Instagram, and my website is at thebluelenses.com, and you can find all about me there. I have a very Googleable name. I'm easy to find. Thank you, Anna. I love you.
I love that we get to have these chats. As I mentioned before, you're the only person I would stay up past midnight for.
Oh, you're a queen. You're an absolute hero. I'm so sorry. You must be wrecked.
I am thrilled. I am buzzing. I'm buzzing with information and sympathy and empathy and new knowledge about Snowtown and Adelaide.
Beautiful. It's actually really lovely. Incredible beach. Incredible beaches, like suburban beaches there. Like, incredible. Incredible.
I have to say, I'm not the biggest fan of suburbia, so suburban beach just sounds like horror movie territory for me.